Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Philosophy. This is Professor Paul Hicks, and today we're going to talk about a paper in ethics by the philosopher Peter Singer. Peter Singer is probably the most famous ethics philosopher of our time. He writes very extensively on our need to help the poor, on animal suffering, and all sorts of other areas in ethics. On this particular paper, it's entitled Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So to get started, let me go ahead and give you a couple quotes from other people and from other thinkers. So Martin Luther King said, "It is a tragic mix-up when the United States spends $500,000 for every enemy soldier killed and only $53 annually on the victims of poverty." All right, so think about that, the victims of poverty. How much should we really help? When we're spending lots of money on our military, we're spending lots of money on all sorts of other projects, but what should we spend to eradicate poverty? Another one, you may have heard of Mother Teresa. She argued that it is poverty to decide that a child must die so that you may live as you wish. Aristotle says poverty is the parent of revolution. So I think you're going to start getting a little idea about what we are about to talk about. So in this paper, Famine, Affluence, and Morality, Peter Singer writes this in the fall of 1971. And at that particular time, there is a crisis going on in Bengal. There has been some natural disasters, there is famine, there's been war. Many people are displaced. In fact, about 9 million people have been displaced and are without any sort of shelter, food, clean water, medical care. And what obligations do we have to help people out like this? So just to give a little bit of background on what was happening back in 1971, the World Bank said in order to solve the problem of Bengal, you would need about $300 million to do it. Now just think about that. Now it sounds like $300 million is a lot of money, but just think about the kind of money that, say, the United States government has, or the British government has, or the Australian government has, right? All of these well-developed, rich nations, how much money do they really have, and how much should they really spend to help the poor, the global poor? Well, let's go ahead and think about what people did spend their money on at that time. Instead of sending, say, the $300 million that would have ended the problem in Bengal, the British government spent about $23 million to go help the poor, but that wasn't enough. Just think of what instead of spending money on the Concorde project, that same year, they invested in essentially a really fast jet called the Concorde. And they spent about $300 million on that one jet alone. So what Peter Singer is saying, that the British government valued one jet more than they valued the lives of 9 million people. Right? They could have spent that money to save 9 million people, but they didn't. Instead, they invested it in a jet. The Australian government spent only 1/12 of the money that they spent on the Sydney Opera House. I'm sure you've seen this on postcards and other places. And so what Peter Singer says is the lives of 9 million refugees, according to the Australian government, is only 1/12 the value of an actual opera house. So once again, these are countries that could have solved the problem, but chose not to do it and rather spent their money on things which really aren't as important as the lives of 9 million people. So what Singer wants to argue here is that the way people live in relatively affluent nations, they react to situations like what was happening in Bengal. This way of reacting to it simply cannot be justified. So the way of life that we take for granted in our society really needs to be altered if we're going to try to fit our moral conceptual scheme. So let's go ahead and lay out a couple moral assumptions that he says that we all hold. All right, so the first one here is suffering and death from a lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Is that true? Is it actually bad for people to die or suffer because they don't have food, clean water, medical care, shelter? Singer seems to think that if you hold that that's a false statement, that that's a false moral assumption, there's not much we could do about talking to you about this, right? So we go ahead and we'll hold that first moral assumption. Now let's go ahead and talk about a second moral assumption here. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of moral comparison, we ought, morally speaking, to do it. So let's think about what this is. So you have the ability to stop something really bad from happening. Now you, morally speaking, should be obligated to stop that really bad thing from happening if you can, right, without sacrificing, making the situation worse or something of that sort. So he gives an example of, imagine you're in a park and you happen to be walking by a pond, and in this pond there happens to be a child, and the child is drowning. Now you could walk into the pond and save the child, okay? Do you have a moral obligation to do so? What would you think of somebody that says, you know, I would love to save the child, but I just bought these brand new shoes and I don't want to get them wet and dirty. And so they just sit there and watch the child drown. What would be wrong? Is there anything wrong with that? If somebody just sat and watched a child drowning, would there something wrong with that? Would it be wrong because, you know, they didn't want to get their new shoes dirty or their new pants dirty? The problem with this is that the individual would be valuing the pants or the new shoes more than they value the life of the child. Well, is that morally acceptable or not? Peter Singer seems to think that it's absolutely not morally acceptable. But see, here's the problem. We all do this. We all go out and spend money on things we do not need when there's a lot of people that are suffering around the world, right? So for example, if I, bought a pair of jeans that cost, say, $200. Now, I could have bought a pair of jeans, say, from Walmart or Target for about 20, 30 bucks, and then sent the rest of that extra money that I had over to stop some sort of famine, right? I could have sent it to save the lives of other people, but I didn't. Well, isn't that just the same thing as saying, I value these new pair of jeans more than I value the lives of other people, right? Why are you not sending that money? Why are you not sending your excess money over to help other people? Why are you spending it on things that you truly don't actually need, but usually you only buy because it makes yourself look good? Is that really, morally speaking, as important or more important than the lives of millions of people? All right, so let's go ahead and think about some basic objections here that Peter Singer wants to consider. So some people are going to say, look, the reason that I don't help out the Bengali children is because, they're so far away, right? It's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And that really I'm only obligated to assist those that are near to me. And so I would help the child in the pond because the child in the pond is near to me, but the starving children in Bengal, they're not near to me, and so therefore I don't have an obligation for that. Okay, well, here's his response. When the moral principles that we just put up, right, that suffering and death from a lack of food, shelter, and medical care is bad, and if we can stop something bad from happening without sacrificing something of greater moral comparison, we ought, morally speaking, to do it. Where in that argument, in those premises, does it say that you should only help those that are closer? Where in there does it say proximity ought to be included here? It doesn't. In fact, it's actually irrelevant, right? If I help a neighbor child or if I help a Bengali whose name I'm never even going to know. See, what proximity does is that it may tell me who I shall help. It doesn't tell me who I ought to help. Just because I probably will help the child that I happen to see, it doesn't mean that I should not help the child that I don't see. Let's go ahead and consider another possible objection here. What if somebody was to say, I'm able to help the people closer to me, but I'm not in Bengal, so I really can't help the Bengali children? Well, there is a problem here because, as Peter Singer notes, he says, look, we live in a global village now. We have networks in place where you can get relief to famine-prone areas right away. You can't just go online, put in your credit card number or your PayPal account or whatever, and send money to a relief organization right away. You don't have to actually be in Bengal to actually do it. You just need to give, right? You don't need to actually be there. There's people on the ground that are going to go ahead and take care of that for you. They just need the money or the support, the financial assistance to actually do it. Okay, let's think about another possible objection. What if I was to say, look, I'm only one person here, and there's literally millions of other people in the same position, and since they're not doing anything, why should I? Right? So why can't I just say, look, other people aren't doing it, so why should I have to do it? Here's a problem with that. That only serves to make you feel less guilty, right? It has nothing to do with what our actual moral obligation happens to be. So for example, if we go back to the child drowning in the pond, should I consider myself less obliged to pull out that drowning child if I happen to see other people just standing around and not doing anything? So imagine I see the child drowning in the pond, and there's a group of 5 people just standing there watching the child drown. Do I still have a moral obligation to pull the child out? Am I doing something morally speaking wrong if I just stand there and watch the child drown? Is it a good excuse if I was to say, well, other people aren't helping, why should I? No, you still have an obligation to pull the child out. What other people do is not relevant. You're responsible for what you do, not for the moral failings of other people. You need to do what you need to do, right? Okay, let's go ahead and give another possible objection here. So, look, what if we were to say this? If everybody just gave $5 to these types of problems, then the entire problem would be solved. So what I should do is only give $5. That way, my obligation is settled, and the fact that you didn't give your $5, hey, that's not on me. That's on you, right? Well, there's a problem with this. It assumes, number one, that people are actually giving $5. So what we have here as an objection is that the premise of the objection is a hypothetical. And they're using the hypothetical to derive a conclusion that is actual. That is, you can't actually do that. You can't say, well, here's this hypothetical situation, therefore I can go ahead and get rid of the actual situation. No, you're responsible for what actually is, not what might be, what hypothetically is possible to be. You're responsible for the actual, right? Maybe somebody will say, but look, if everybody gave as much as they could, then the problem would be solved, and the extra money that I send will happen to be wasted. And so the sacrifice of my money would be wasted, and so I don't want to give money because others are obligated to give what they can, and I don't want my money wasted. Well, let's think about that for just a bit here. Peter Singer thinks this is a rather absurd objection here. The reason being is that it assumes that, in fact, people do give as much as they could. But the problem here, the paradox only arises when people, in fact, do give as much as they could. But the fact is, we have reason to believe that people are not. The only real possibility of this is happening is if we all gave at the exact same time without the knowledge of everybody else giving. Can you imagine that? That we all just decided to log on to give to Oxfam or AMFA or something like that, all at the same time, and so that there was too much money now given. That doesn't seem to be rational. What's the chances of that? What's the likelihood of that? And if you really were to say, okay, let's say that we didn't know, but everybody was going to go ahead and give as much as they can, and they all do it at the right moment. There's no actual planning of this. It just happens that everybody does this at the same time. Okay, so now what would we find? We would be in a situation where the refugees have too many supplies rather than not enough. So what's actually worse? Is it worse if the refugees have too much food? Or is it worse that the refugees are starving? Right? It seems a pretty obvious answer here. Right? Even, if we were to say the consequences are going to be out better if I give my money away, if I give my excess and my luxurious money away, rather than keeping it for myself to spend it on things that I really don't need. So Singer says is there's some hesitation on the part of people here to accept this moral understanding, and it has to do with what philosophers call supererogatory. So let's go ahead and think of what this term actually means. Right? It's a good philosophical term of the day for you to learn. Supererogatory. A supererogatory act is any sort of act which it would be good to do, but it's not wrong to not do it. So people often think of charity here. So people donate to charity. Giving to the Bengal Relief Fund is considered an act of charity. Organizations which collect money are known as charities. When you donate to a charity, you're actually thanked for your generosity. But so when we praise the person that gives money, we praise the person that is charitable. But what do we think about the person who doesn't give? If it's good to actually give, why don't we condemn the person who's able to solve these problems but doesn't? Why? Why do we feel that that person's not doing something wrong? If you're hoarding money and there's no possible way for you to spend it all or something like that, maybe you're like an Elon Musk or a Jeff Bezos or a Bill Gates or somebody like that. Right? If you can't spend all the money that you have, but you are able to give that money away to help people, to save the lives of millions and millions of people, is there something wrong with you? Did you do something wrong for not saving the lives of people? Isn't this really the same thing as what Peter Singer was talking about when we talk about the child drowning in the pond? Right? You have people that are spending money on things they don't need, but they're doing it at the expense of people that do need, right? So think about, say, like new clothes or buying a new car. So, or maybe even just coffee. So here is a cup of Starbucks coffee that I just happened to have bought that cost me probably about $4. Now, I could have, instead of spent $4 at Starbucks, I could have made coffee at home for probably about 25 cents or 50 cents for a pot. I could have poured that coffee and then saved that $3.50 and sent that off to the Bengal Relief Fund. But I didn't. Did I do something wrong? And if so, where is the wrongness? Right? Where is the wrongness? Or think about a car. Say maybe you need to go buy a car. You got to get from point A to point B. Now you could go buy, say, a very decent car that will last you for a while, say a Honda or a Nissan or something like that. But you don't want that. You want, say, a BMW or a Mercedes. Right? You want something that's classier. You want something that is going to make you look good. But is that looking good? Is that worth it? You really could have spent that money, right? I mean, you could have spent that money on saving the lives of millions of people. But instead of doing that, you went out and spent that money on yourself, not for any actual important thing, just so that you look good. Is your looking good of greater moral comparison than to somebody who's actually dying and really needs that money? See, Peter Singer seems to think that, just say buying new clothes to look well dressed rather than say going to a thrift shop to buy clothes, that you're not sacrificing anything of greater moral comparison if you just bought cheap clothes rather than very expensive designer clothes, right? Looking well dressed, while it might make you feel good, is not a moral imperative, right? So it's not that Singer is saying that there are no acts of charity or that giving to charity is bad or anything like that. Right? There are acts of charity, but what we need to do is redraw the distinction between duty and charity. And that the way that we currently draw it, where we currently say, this is what I'm obligated to do, we are not drawing it in the right place, right? He says, quote, all I am arguing here is that the present way of drawing the distinction, which makes it an act of charity for a man living at the level of affluence, which most people in developed nations enjoy, to give money to save someone else from starving, cannot be supported. There is no justification to spend money on, expensive things that you don't need, rather than sending that money to some sort of relief fund to save the lives of people, right? Okay, so let's consider a couple more objections here, shall we? Some objections to this, somebody might say, it seems too drastic of a moral scheme. It's too drastic of a revision of our moral scheme, right? People don't ordinarily judge morality in the way that Singer is suggesting that they should. See, most people reserve their moral condemnation for those who violate, say, some sort of moral norm, such as the norm against taking somebody's property, stealing. They do not condemn those who indulge in luxury instead of giving to famine relief. So a side objection to this is that we ought to have a moral code which is not too far beyond the capacities of the ordinary man, for otherwise there will be a general breakdown of compliance and a greater harm is going to occur. Okay, so let's kind of think this objection out just a little bit, shall we? Imagine, say, I'm trying to lose weight, right? There's something that a lot of people have to deal with. They're trying to lose weight, and so they go on a diet. And you're doing great on the diet. But then you happen to pass a donut shop. And this donut shop had just made fresh donuts, and they have a fan, right, blowing outside the donut shop, the smell and the scent of those wonderful fresh donuts. And so you think, I've been pretty good. I'm going to go and have one donut. Okay, so you go in there and have one donut, and now how do you feel? Right? How many people would feel something like, oh, well, I had that donut and now I just ruined my diet, and so I can't do this diet, and instead of one, I'm just going to have more donuts now. And that they give up on the diet altogether. So think about this about morality, that if you make it too hard to be a decent moral person, if we have some sort of moral scheme where it's too hard to fulfill and it's too hard to follow, maybe people will just give up on being moral. And that in the long run, if you make it too hard to be moral, then people will give up on morality altogether. And that the situation will actually be worse if people give up on morality altogether. The problem with that, is that really likely? I mean, are people really going to say, oh, well, you say I should donate money to the poor, but you know what, that's too hard to do. Screw morality. I am just going to do whatever I want, and I'm not going to be a moral person at all. I don't think that's really the likely outcome of what's going to happen, do you? All right. So what Singer is not attempting to show is what people actually do, but really about what people really ought to do. And so the conclusion follows from the principles that he has advanced, the two moral assumptions that we've talked about at the very beginning. So the objection doesn't really obtain. Now, it is still true that if you accept his principles, you really should accept the conclusion that the way we live in industrialized societies cannot be, morally speaking, justified. All right. So I know some of you are thinking like, this is just outrageous. Who would really hold such a belief like this? Well, for those of you that are religious, go into your holy texts. What does it say? So just, as an example here, I'm going to use Christianity for a bit here. If you were to go into Deuteronomy 15:7, it would say this: if there is a poor man among your brothers in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. All right, so what are we being told to do in Deuteronomy 15:7? All right, if somebody needs something, what am I supposed to do? Give it to them. That's what we're commanded to do. Now, maybe some of you are thinking, that's Old Testament. Nobody really believes that. Okay, let's go to the New Testament. Let's take a look at Luke 6, verse 29 through 31. And in Luke, we are told, if someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back. Do to others as you would have them do to you. Right? So here we have the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have other people do unto you. If you were poor and starving and your family was starving and dying, what would you have people do? Would you say, oh, don't give me that money, don't help me out, go buy the BMW, that's more important, right? So this seems to be a problem. A little further, in Luke 21, right, he says, as he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. And Jesus says, I tell you the truth, this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people they're given their gifts out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. So this poor woman gives everything she can to help others. Where these rich people aren't giving everything they have. They're just giving something really small, which to them doesn't mean anything. Who really gave more? Who was, from a moral perspective, better? Now, maybe you still need some help here. Let's talk about Mark 10:25. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. What does this mean? It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In other words, think about that. Can you put a camel through the eye of a needle? That would be absolutely impossible to do, right? So what's going to happen to rich people? Right? According to Mark 10:25, they're not getting in. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. They hoarded wealth. Now, maybe you think, maybe we're misinterpreting that. Well, Matthew 19:24, Jesus says, again, I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. It is very clear what Jesus wanted us to do is to give our money away, is to give up everything, and to support the poor, to help out other people. This is what we're commanded to do. Isn't that what Peter Singer is really attempting to say? Now, Peter Singer's not coming from a religious background here. That's not the issue. But I want you to notice that it's not as drastic as it might seem. Right? The holy text that people believe in happen to endorse this type of view, I think. So if we're to go to and think about Islam for a moment here, they have what's called the zakat, which is a thanksgiving to God by supporting those who are in need. So in Islam, the true owners of things is not man, but rather God. And the acquisition of wealth for its own sake, or so that it may increase a man's worth, that's actually condemned. The mere acquisition of wealth counts for nothing in the sight of God. It does not give man any merit in this life or in the hereafter. And what Islam is teaching is that people should acquire wealth with the intention of spending it on their own needs, yes, but also on the needs of others. Right? So man, said the prophet, says, my wealth, my wealth. Have you not any wealth except that which you give as alms and thus preserve, wear, and tatter, eat, and use up? Right? All you really need with that wealth is something to wear, some food, right? The basic necessities of life. Everything else is extra, right? Okay, so, I think that what Peter Singer is doing is actually quite in line with a lot of religious values. But something has happened for people in developed nations and industrialized nations to where they've gotten away from this. And Peter Singer says, we need to come back to this. We need to actually help the poor. We have a moral obligation to assist those that need it. All right? So that's Peter Singer, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Think about that for a bit. I know it seems really extreme. I know some people are going to say, well, does Peter Singer do this? First of all, if that's going to be your response, that is what we call an ad hominem fallacy. You're saying something about him rather than what we ought to do and what the argument actually is. But Peter Singer does, apparently, so we're told, give about 40% of his income away. So that he is doing something. Right? Do something. Make the world a better place. Be the change that you want to see in the world. It all comes down to you and what your choices are. All right. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I'll see you next time.